Welcome to Lead Like Her, a podcast about female leadership and how lessons from sport translate to life. My name is Violet, and I am so glad you're here today. I'm a member of the women's basketball team at Denison University, and throughout my life, sports have shaped who I am. They've taught me resilience, confidence, and the importance of having great leaders around you. But I've also learned that confidence isn't something you just have. It's something you build. And for many athletes like myself, it's an ongoing journey. That curiosity is what inspired this podcast. As part of my research on female leadership in sport, I'm sitting down with women who are leading at every level of athletics and business to learn about their experiences, the challenges they've faced, and the lessons that have shaped them as leaders. Whether you're an athlete, a coach, or someone who's simply interested in becoming a better leader, I hope these conversations leave you feeling inspired and give you something you can take into your own life. Thanks for listening, and let's get into today's conversation. Today, I'm excited to welcome Nan Carney-DeBord to the show. Today's conversation is all about leadership, being resilient, and what it really takes to create a lasting impact. To even begin to cover Nan's career, I could probably spend this entire introduction talking about her accomplishments. But to give you a quick overview, her career has spanned coaching, athletic administration, and mentorship, all at the highest levels. Throughout that journey, she's led with authenticity, built strong team cultures, and helped open doors for the next generation of women in sports. In this episode, we talk about the lessons she learned early in her coaching career, how she developed her leadership style, the power of mentorship, and why equity and purpose have remained at the center of everything she does. Nan has so much wisdom to share, and I know you're going to take something away from this conversation. So let's jump in. Nan, thank you so much for being on the Lead Like Her podcast today. I really appreciate you taking the time. I mean, you just have a vast experience throughout your entire life. You started as the head coach at Ohio Wesleyan, coaching field hockey, coaching basketball at the same time. You've spent decades leading athletes, coaches, and entire athletic departments. So, first question is, when people who know you best describe your leadership, what do you hope they say? Or how would you define your leadership style today?
I specifically, I don't know what the early days of my coaching, like student athletes would describe it, but I would think overall people would describe me as a servant leader, collaborative, using the strengths of those around me, versus authoritarian, because in that you truly have to know yourself, and not only values and core competencies, but consistent actions of what it is you're doing and why you're doing it, knowing your why.
Yeah.
So as a servant leader.
And being collaborative, I think that's a huge thing, is recognizing that you don't have strengths in every single field, but being able to ask people for help, get those people involved, because then that makes them more care about the holistic approach or the whole mission of what you're trying to accomplish.
Exactly. And I would also like to think that people would say that I'm truly authentic in my leadership and my intentions are real. But to your point, if you have the opportunity, you want to hire, I was able to hire people smarter and more talented than I am to better the whole. And at the end of the day, my number one focus throughout my career has been the student, and whether it's the student athlete or the student, music performer, but the student, how can we impact the life of the student?
Well, you're very humble, Nan. Very humble. When you're talking about authenticity, do you think this has evolved over time? Or have you always stayed consistent with your values?
Yeah, I think I would say I've always been consistent, because in leadership, which we can talk about what that leadership journey looked like. But in leadership, if you're trying to be someone else, at the end of the day, it's going to be observed. And so, how do you lead with knowing your own self and because leadership is constantly changing. So that doesn't mean that your values change. So, I always had an overall life theme of pride, passion, and purpose. And I took that all the way through my coaching. And as I became more, I started my administrative leadership at Ohio Wesleyan as the senior associate director. But when I got into administration, I added 2 more P's in perseverance and process. And because I think, and then when you lead and you have a consistent theme to fall back on, what is it? What is your why? I've always been passionate about higher education, period. In addition to the competitive excellence that college athletics brings to the forefront. But I always saw athletics as a platform and an opportunity to inform the liberal arts. I didn't see it as a freestanding object.
You've been an athlete your whole life. You played basketball at Denison, graduated in 1980, and went on and still continue to serve students and coaches. And I'm just curious, you're talking about the 5 Ps. When did you develop that, and how was the 5 Ps developed from, when you were a young coach until like you worked in administration to athletic director and now as a business owner?
Yeah. So that's a really good question, Violet. I was a head coach at age 23. So I would say that while I understood the skills and I understood what my vision was for, at that time, that was at Bethany College, and I was the head coach of field hockey and the head coach of softball and an assistant basketball coach. But in my head coaching realm, I always use the institutional values and mission to be able to say, why did you choose this institution? Why are you here? Why are we, who are we playing for? That's bigger than this particular contest. Because I always tell the story, my very first competition as a head coach at age 23 in field hockey, we lost the match 0-10. And that's like 100 to 50 in basketball terms. I mean, that is a crush. And I thought, oh my goodness, I chosen the wrong profession. This is all my self-talk and my internal dialogue. But in the meantime, to the student athlete, I stayed positive and said, we have to look at this strategically and how we can best, improve and be ready to go. So, I talked a lot about pride in self, pride in team, pride in institution. And then I truly was passionate. The 2 sports that I had the opportunity to compete in at Denison were field hockey and basketball. And there were no divisions when I played. So, for instance, in field hockey, one of our greatest rivals was Ohio University. And yeah. We played Ohio State. We played Miami. We played Davidson Elkins. And the smaller schools like Worcester and Kenyon and Ohio Wesleyan, those were not as competitive. And so we were competing at a very high level very early on. And so I was passionate about competitive performance at a very young age. And so pride in self, pride in your work ethic, pride in what you're displaying as a student athlete, passion, you demonstrate passion every time you step on the court, whether it's practice, whether, it's a warm up in a game or whether it's playing for a national championship. And that's a consistent trait that, I look to and observe in others, because when you get to the hiring phase, you want to hire passionate people. and people who align with your values. And then purpose. Why are we doing this? Why are we putting so much time into it? Why is it so important to us? Once again, connecting the individual why with the team why, the department why, the institutional why. And then when it's all integrated, it works much more efficiently.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for explaining those things. I kind of want to go back to when you talked about your first match. You lost 10-0. Probably, and you're 23 years old at the time. I'm sure you experienced some self-doubt, lack of confidence.
Just a little.
Just a little bit. How did you become resilient and pick yourself up and say, you know what? I'm going to be better.
Yeah. Well, you know this because you do it and you demonstrate it daily, but you don't become resilient doing easy things. You become resilient doing hard things and doing hard things well. And coaching is a hard thing. It's really hard. I mean, you know the blended personalities of and the collective behavior of your group. And that's true with all teams and all people in all instances. And it's true in business. And it's true in senior leadership of the institution. How do we work best together to help the institution? So yes, well, back in those days, we took vans, not buses. And not only was I coaching the game, I was driving the van. And so I was thinking, okay, my director at the time, my director of athletics, who became one of my finest mentors throughout my career. I thought, oh my goodness, he took a risk on me, and I'll be lucky to have a job after this game. You inflate it like everybody's watching the game or anybody even cares, and we didn't even have live stream. So, but in your mind, it's big. It's your first game. It's your first match. And how was I going to keep the student athletes engaged and confident? And that taught me early on, I think, one of my greatest lessons about leadership, Violet, and that's like leadership is about everybody else. Leadership is not about me. Leadership is about everybody else. So if you really understand that and you really believe that, my number one focus was, okay, how do I help each individual develop and how are we going to develop as a team? And flash forward, we were competing in a really small conference in the Pennsylvania, Northern West Virginia area. And we ended up winning the conference, but, and having a, winning record, which we hadn't in a while. But our first opponent was very, very difficult. So it was, once again, coming back to my 5 Ps, the process. What was the process? Everybody wants to know the outcome. How many people say to you after a game, hey, how many loose balls did you get? Even how many assists did you get? Or how many rebounds? How many did you play? Did you start? Did you score? And those are so really insignificant in the big scheme of things. Mm-hmm. So what is the process?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I was very shaky in confidence after that match.
Mm-hmm. No, and that's completely valid. But like you said, and this is a very important thing that you have stated, is like leadership is about everyone else. So instead of making it about you, oh, I'm a bad coach, I'm not good enough for this, it's you're turning your perspective. Okay, how can we do better for the team, for everyone else? So I think that's just a really important point for all athletes and coaches to recognize is it's not about you. No. It's about the whole team. And it's about being process oriented, taking every day at a time.
Yep. So, and also understanding the piece, and this will come throughout our conversation today, is the mentorship piece. I was blessed with an incredible mentor in that first experience. And I have to say, he sat on my shoulder even my whole time at Denison. And we can get into that a little bit more deeply as we talk today.
Yeah, for sure. You said he was the athletic director?
Yep. And when I left to go to Ohio Wesleyan, 3 years later, he left and became the athletic director at Case Western Reserve and finished his career there.
Okay. Gotcha.
And his name is Dr. David Hutter. And he kept in touch with me throughout my time at Denison.
I think it's important to recognize the impact that mentors have on individuals. At Denison, one of our stats that we talk about in the admissions office is 93% of Denison students graduate with a mentor. Would you say you had a mentor at Denison, or when did you?
Most certainly. And you've met her. I mean, I was one of my mentors. I had several, but one was my basketball coach. And, when I see her on the wall in your locker room, I mean, that just gives me incredible pride. And she offered mentorship above and beyond the skills of the game. Everything from strength and conditioning. She was well beyond her time in strength and conditioning and nutrition, and just nutrition for women. So she was, like I said, well ahead of her time. And so Lynn Schweizer was an incredible mentor. I had a field hockey coach who's no longer with us at Denison, who was also an incredible mentor. And then I had faculty members. So I was very fortunate. And I did, at that age, I truly took it for granted. I didn't realize its impact. I didn't realize how important it is. And it wasn't talked about as much. Like in the admission, 93% of all students have a mentor. It was something that was foundational and almost visceral to the Denison experience. That relational piece. When I took the position at Denison, I gained so many friends. That was what was really special. That I wasn't, I didn't take the job thinking, oh, I'm going to have new friends, but it just happened because there's a connective piece to a Denisonian.
How do you handle the difference between having friends, but also being an authority figure and kind of laying down the line? Did you find there to be challenges with that?
Well, when I say friends, I guess I was thinking more of different generations of Denisonians. So really on the alumni front, in terms of students and the individuals for whom I was a supervisor, I'd like to say they would say I was friendly, but we weren't hanging out together after work or those types of things, but had enough interest in their lives that they hopefully felt cared for. If they were going through a significant struggle with, an aging parent or a new baby or, a health issue, to be able to have those conversations and recognize that I care deeply about my people, and especially the students and coaches.
For sure. So, Nan, you've experienced women's sports evolve firsthand, especially during Title IX. Like, you were in the thick of it. What changes have been the most meaningful to you?
There have been just so many changes. And so many more opportunities. That's a really interesting question that I'm asked a lot, especially when I'm speaking in Title IX forums or so on. But I think women can finally lead with their own style. I think that's probably the number one change I've seen, and not just in athletics and not just with Title IX, but just globally. You look at major leagues, you look at professional basketball players, people are leading. There are gender differences in leadership styles. When you study leadership for as long as I have, there are gender differences, and you tend to take on leadership characteristics of those mentors that are impacting you, whether you know it or not. So I had many in my rise in my early career, my rise in coaching and administrative leadership. I had a lot of male lead mentors, but I didn't have the female mentors that I did as an undergrad. And I noticed that now there are more mentorship opportunities with women so women can lead authentically. So that's number one. I think I was put in a role early on in college athletics, and I probably learned this from Denison, is I've always been curious, and I've always asked why. And I've always stood for equity and social justice without really putting a label on it. It just is what I did. So when you mentioned my Ohio Wesleyan experience and how I was coaching two sports at the same time. What I'm really proud about was I was also a tenure track faculty member, and I was teaching a full teaching load in addition to that.
That's crazy.
It was crazy.
That's insane.
That's insane.
I mean,
and if you look historically, there are many, many women who coached. If you ask Lynn, she was coaching basketball, swim and dive. She was coaching volleyball. And then she was paving the path for the next generation, the next decade, which was my decade. And to your point, it was crazy. But the good news about that experience is once I was tenured, I was more confident to voice my observations. And I didn't start out having a voice. When I was an undergraduate at Denison, I wasn't bold in every situation. I gained my voice by looking at inequities. It actually started at Denison with observations. And I think I've shared with you the laundry story, how we were practicing, and one of the men on the basketball team said, was in my lab, one of my labs, because at the time I was a biology major. And he said, are we going to, I think it was anatomy and physiology, and we were doing a lab together. And are we going to meet tonight? I said, yeah, but I have to wash my practice gear. He goes, what do you mean you have to wash your practice gear? I said, well, we had a hard practice. It stinks. I got to wash my practice gear. He said, well, they wash our practice gear for us. I said, what? You're kidding. So, I nudged a teammate and I said, hey, did you know the guys had got their practice gear washed? And they're like, no, they do. So we asked coach, and then she said, well, you need to ask the person that was in the associate director role, was called the woman's coordinator at the time. So we went up and asked Dr. Van Horn, why do the men get their practice gear washed and we don't? Would you like to know her response?
What'd she say?
She said, because men sweat and women perspire.
What?
Okay. So we took our reversibles the next day, and respectfully, I always preface with that, laid them on her desk. Okay. So that's undergrad.
Yeah.
The next day we got practice gear washed.
Wow.
And I believe you still do today. And it's
So you
probably
showed the difference.
And you probably don't even think about it.
No.
But, so that was just an inequity. And even my friend who I was in class with said, that stinks, and it wasn't, he agreed that was an inequity, which was great. So when we talk about Title IX, sometimes people confuse it as a woman's issue versus an equity issue. And so, and we can talk about that as we talk about how we built the many things at Denison. But my point in that story is now there are people in significant roles, like the vice president of finance that at Denison, that said, when we turfed the baseball field, Nan, how long do we have before we need to get the project done for softball? Softball field was the easiest project I've ever been a part of.
Really?
It wasn't not easy because it was cheaper or anything, but because I wasn't fighting for it ad nauseum. Coming up through the ranks, everything seemed like a fight and And that's where that persistence, that perseverance comes in, that P. You just have to keep going back, and they say no, and you come back again. And one of the greatest compliments that I received from the provost at Ohio Wesleyan was, I guess his P for me would be a pest. You never stop coming back, even when I tell you no. Because flash forward, my first year at Ohio Wesleyan, the uniforms, the budget was half that of the men's. And I was friends with the men's coach, so he shared his budget with me. And so, and the uniforms did not fit the women. They were really too small. So I didn't really realize this until we were in a game, and my starting point guard, we had called a timeout, and she sat down, and all of her shorts, the whole seam and the crotch of her shorts ripped out. And I said, do you want to go up and change into a bigger pair? And she goes, no, this is the biggest pair. We wet our uniforms before the game, and we stretched them over chairs so they're big enough. So after the game, flash forward, I took that pair of shorts and respectfully laid it on the provost's desk. The next year, we got new uniforms. We got an equal budget. So once again, that foundation, it wasn't comfortable to take that pair of shorts and lay them. It wasn't comfortable to lay the sweaty reversible jersey on this person of authority's desk. Like, I wasn't overly confident, but to me, it was sort of obvious. So number 2 is that people now are more educated, and so as long as you speak respectfully and do your research and do your homework, I always prepared, for 3 hours, for a 3-hour lecture, for a 1-hour course. My practices were so detailed and to the minute. And then after the practice, I would go back and detail it. So you do the research, you're at the table, you're respectful, and you share the why. Then you can see change. And so I think that I see that Title IX is becoming more of an equity law versus a women's law.
Mm-hmm.
But opportunities, Violet, in sport choices, professional, everything from the CEO to the CFO to, I'm always fascinated to see how many athletic directors in our conference are women, how many presidents in our conference are women. And that's been a changing dynamic over the years. Those opportunities continue to grow.
So when you're talking about these presidents, the CEOs, are you saying that because there's not a lot of female leaders in that position?
No, what I'm saying is I've seen the changing opportunities, and now there are incredible leadership.
And so you said a few stuff that really stood out to me. One of them is the female versus male differences in coaching and leadership. Can you kind of talk about those differences and how you lead differently based on gender?
I just think it's about knowing your culture, knowing your people. And, back in the day, and once again, this is a historical, we're talking about the 80s. And, football, your stereotypic football example and football coach was the way to lead. Banging on a locker was the way to lead. There weren't, and once again, that's a change. And it slowly changed. The way I coached in the 80s was different from the way I coached in the 90s. And that was different from the way I coached in the 2000s. And that was, but in the 80s, football was primarily a men's sport. And it was a style. And when you have male mentors, that you're watching and observing. I watched the men's coach who won the national championship in 1988. I watched him all the time. I'm not a great fan, although I tried hard at your national championship.
You did.
I'm an observer of behavior. So I would always sit behind his bench during games when we weren't playing and just observe how, he did time management and how he was talking to his players. And I assumed some of those qualities. And but that's not what my athletes needed. And I also realized that through developing my own emotional intelligence and being much more self-aware and asking for feedback. Violet, what do you need? What do you need from me? And I carried that through my leadership position at Denison. I would ask the coaches at the end of a evaluation, I would say, my last question to them was always, how can I better serve you? And they might say, well, I need you to stop in more, or even though you're not my direct report, I need to meet with you occasionally, or so on and so forth. I always ask that question. How can I better serve you? So, yeah. So I guess the gender differences that I was referring to, when you studied leadership and you study characteristics, many leadership characteristics in that time, if you were labeling and I gave you a list of leadership characteristics, what seemed more masculine or what seemed more feminine or what seemed more educative or what seemed more, they were more masculine leadership styles, loud, boisterous, heavy-handed, but they worked for the men. And so that's what I was referring to gender differences. And when you studied leadership, you read about, and at the end of the day, you have to figure out what your culture needs.
Mm-hmm.
So in leading a department, my men might need something differently from me than my women needed. And they have to be comfortable to share that with me.
Right. That makes sense. So it seems like in order to become a better leader, you need to be able to build strong relationships with the people that you're leading so that they feel comfortable to tell you what they want and they want to hear.
Yep, that sounds like a definition of empowerment. That's pretty cool.
Okay.
Yeah, and most importantly, you really have to know your culture. And I mentioned coaching differently in the 80s and 90s, and I can give examples, but there were generational differences. We talk about Gen X, we talk about millennials, we talk about Gen Z. I was raised by parents who lived through the Depression. They were very, very strict and very, very hardcore in their leadership styles or parenting styles. Same difference. How are you parenting? What is your parents' leadership style? Because at the end of the day, coaching, teaching, parenting, they're leadership skills.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So with parenting, coaching, being an athletic director, all these meaningful positions have come with obstacles. I was wondering if you could kind of share a story or a difficult decision that you faced as an athletic director and what it taught you about leadership.
So first and foremost, every challenge in our initial minutes of our conversation, resilience came up, and you can only build resilience through adversity and challenge, in my opinion. And of course, hard work and doing hard things. So some of the challenges were in being the first. Like at Denison, I was the first woman athletic director. Okay. At what point does that gender come out of the discussion? And I was the most qualified candidate in the pool. And so early on, especially with some of the older alumni, you could tell that biggest challenge was almost feeling a sense of having to overprove myself, because I would get comments with, are you the athletic director for the whole program or just the women's programs? And, you're always in the limelight and everyone's hanging on your response. So that could be offensive, right? That could feel offensive. But if I was truly going to educate and advance the individuals that are asking those questions, then I have to be strategic. So one of the answers I would say is, no, I'm only the athletic director of the winning programs. And then they would kind of get the idea. They're Denisonians. They're smart. They have integrated thought, worldwide view. They go, I guess that was kind of a stupid question. And there are stupid questions, in my opinion. So I think challenges were, being the first of what you can do. One of the pride factors that specifically to Denison was when I came in, I was also the chair of the Health, Exercise, and Sports Studies program. And it wasn't called that at that time. And so my charge was not only to lead the athletic department, much like my early days in coaching two sports and being on tenure track faculty member in sports psychology, but, I had to do an external review and evaluate the program that was in place and then see what would be best for the university. So a 30-student major department turned into what it is now, 160 or more. Tenure track positions are now in place, and it's a thriving major. As you know from working in the admission office, it's one of the most thriving majors on campus. Of course, we have many now with data analytics and global commerce and communications and so many great majors. But I think the challenge was to be able to always create a values-driven, goal-oriented, mission-driven experience. Because at the end of the day, if you're not mission-driven, you're not goal and values-driven, the student-athlete won't thrive at the same level. I mean, I look at your games and I look at the World Series of baseball and all of the other coaches and student-athletes that were in the audience that was so impressive to me because you're all one. You're all one. And you're doing some incredible work, but you're doing it, success breeds success. Energy feeds energy. Right. So I think the biggest challenge was just the enormity of being able to come in. I know why you chose Denison because of the Mitchell Center. You kind of that name, but there were so many constituents. There was an academic major. There was an athletic department. There was a sport. We developed a sport performance department. We developed a sport medicine department. We have club sports. We have recreational offerings. There were a lot of different constituents to be able to function at a high level in the same space. So I think the biggest challenge was bringing all of those constituents together, realizing that whatever your job was, whatever your vision was for your job, whatever your passion was, at the end of the day, how are we making this best possible student experience? How are we making this in this space?
And
so
Nan,
that was the biggest challenge.
That's a lot.
That's a big challenge.
That's a lot, having to create all of this new stuff, sports medicine, athletic training, HES, recreational sports, like you're creating all that. And it's not just you alone doing it. How do you get people to buy into the fact this is what I want to do?
Well, because that's not how I went about it. I think one of the greatest achievements and hopefully legacies that continue is what we did as an entire building. A division was we built the Mitchell mission, and we took 18 months to 2 years doing that all together. And so when we had monthly staff meetings, we did not discuss who was playing this week. I mean, we did casually, but big games or we didn't discuss anything that we could achieve in an email or in a direct report system. We worked in teams. And I don't know if you've read the book by Army General Stanley McChrystal called Team of Teams, but I read that early on in my time at Denison, and I thought that's really remarkable how this Army general wanted to defend a portion of our country through teams. So it made sense in the building where we were living. But it's funny, you would think that people in athletics and people around athletics would understand team cohesion and teamwork and team and group productivity. But the majority of our culture really doesn't, because everyone is focused on self. Think of what we have now. We have, we can quickly scroll and we can get information as quickly as our phones. You come to a day with so much on your mind before you even walk in the room for an 8:00 staff meeting. Where is your mind, and so on and so forth. So what we did with the help of my leadership team is we made teams. So by the time I left, we had about 70 people attending our staff meetings. So we had teams, like 10 teams of 7. And on those teams, you didn't sit with people like, if I don't know if this is what happens in your classroom. You tend to sit in the same seat, even if it's not assigned. You sit next to people you're comfortable with, or so on and so forth. So they were put on teams like the head football coach might be with an assistant swim coach. And you think about where their competitive environment is, we're at opposite ends of the building. So they might not really even ever speak other than once a month, just by nature, unless you were very intentional. So you were assigned a team as soon as in the first, and we started out a 2-day retreat each year. And we talked about, what our vision was for the academic year to achieve by the end of the academic year as a division. And so after 18 to 2 years of work in teams, and then we would have like an executive writing team. So anything that the teams would produce would go to this other team, and they would just sort it out, and they would come to the Mitchell mission. Through sport and physical movement, develop leaders with character, prepared to thrive in a challenging global society. Now, hopefully that's Violet Mitchell. And I hope that's also every other single student that walks in that building, whether they're on an athletic team or whether they're a Hess major or whether they're interested in sport medicine or sport performance, or whether they're going into, there'll be through sport and physical movement, develop leaders, not students, not people, leaders with character, values, right? Prepared to thrive, not achieve, thrive in a challenging global society. So when you asked me, my answers are long-winded, I know, but you asked me originally, how did you say we're going to do it this way? No. How are we going to do it? Who are we? What is our mission? So all 70 of us wrote the mission statement.
I see. It's not you saying it. It's everyone.
So
and
then
it goes back to what you said. Leadership is about everyone else.
Leadership is about everyone else. And think about it. If you take part in the writing of it, how much are you bought into it? Think about the goals and the values you have for your individual basketball program. How bought in are you? Are you a part of that decision, or are they just placed on you? This is what you have to think. No, Denisonians aren't taught what to think. They're taught how to think. So there's our mission. Same thing with our core values. We came up, how to achieve a mission. Our core values, character, respect, and inclusion. Okay, what are the action steps to get to those core values, core competencies? Mentorship, innovation, communication. And the whole team of teams defined what each of those meant. If you notice, it's not character and integrity, it's character. With character, you have integrity. But we define those as a highly functional department team. And I think that's one of the things I'm really most proud of, because once everybody was, I remember my very first year in 2011, the very first staff meeting, and they're sitting in their teams and they're like, what is this? And then they realized when we did some, icebreakers and all those good things, but But that was a part of the communication at the end, the core competency. Like when we first started this conversation this morning, you asked me, where are you? And I asked you, where are you? We're talking from Chicago to Maine. And there's some reason that Chicago's important to you. Right now, it's your brother's graduation party. And because we communicated, I listened and I realized what's important to you, your family.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how we did it. But that's why I have the most respect and the highest regard for everyone who works in the Mitchell Center. And once again, whether it was someone who worked on the fields, was on a team, to someone who was the deputy director of athletics was assigned to a team.
Wow. So you came into the athletic director role and that was what you did, is created teams. That was like the first thing. Wow. And that was after you read that book.
Well, that was not just that book. Remember, I'm an academic nerd and I've studied leadership. I was first really turned on to it in the 80s when it just really started some research. I can remember John Maxwell, the 17 essential qualities of a team player. John Maxwell, the 24 indisputable qualities of a leader. Daniel Goleman, and talked about emotional intelligence. In my upbringing, it was only IQ and what's your IQ and what's your, standardized testing and so on. And then this whole concept of emotional intelligence and I had aha moments. I understand self-awareness. I understand self-regulation. I needed to understand those. I wasn't I was frantic, but I wasn't the coach that was chasing the officials. I self-regulated, even when the call was incorrect, in my opinion. But just understanding the importance of social skills. Hello, thank you. How was your day? And don't make it rhetorical. I'm really interested in if you're having a good day. So I would say Maxwell, Goleman, Jim Collins, Good to Great. Love that book. And I would just read anything I could get my hands on. And why it worked when I was in that crazy, silly job description of 2 sports and teaching was because my teaching informed my coaching. Because I was studying leadership and I was studying sport psychology. So I felt I could be a better coach because I was bringing really state of the art stuff. I can remember my very first year talking about PMA, positive mental attitude. I should have published it. I didn't. But to this day, my athletes from my 80s will throw in a Facebook note, PMA, and I understand what they're talking about. So yeah. So it was through that. And then when I came to Denison, I viewed it as taking on a leadership challenge. I wanted a different leadership challenge. I loved coaching. I loved teaching, but I wanted a different leadership challenge. So when I came in with a plan, my first week on the job, I interviewed every head coach and every program director for at least an hour. One went 3 hours. And then I took all of my notes and I would handwrite because I wanted it to be personal. I didn't have my computer in front of my face. It was you and me, and I was handwriting notes. Then I came to where I am right now and spread out all my notes and said, okay, at this time, in this space, what does this group need? And I took all of my past study and experiences. I didn't lead the way my great mentor, David Hutter, led. I didn't lead the way Jay Martin led, Dr. Gordon led. I led the way I thought the department needed after careful reflection. And I carved out that time prior to actually starting.
I mean, you just said so many important things that I want to make sure I hit. The first thing that I want to kind of go back to you about what you said is the importance of listening to people and the research. You took time and you're a constant learner. I think that's an important part about leadership is you're constantly learning. You're constantly trying to better yourself. So while you're having those crazy jobs doing 4 billion things at once, you're also getting your hands on every single leadership book because you're trying to learn and trying to get better. I mean, that's one of the great qualities about you is that you're constantly trying to improve.
Yep.
And then you take that, when we were talking earlier about authenticity, you're taking what you're learning, then you're taking what the people are saying who you're about to lead, and you're combining that to your authentic self and your leadership. And I think it puts a whole bow on it.
Boom.
You know? Yeah, so it's really special what you did. And going back to the Mitchell Center, I mean, it is just a special place. It really is. You walk in for a Division III school like Denison to have the Mitchell Center. It's pretty special, and you're very humble, but you should be so proud of everything that you've done, and you've led all these people to create this environment where I can come in, my team can come in, students at Denison, and they can be like, okay, this is where I better myself, but in a different way.
Yep. Yeah, it's, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, the sport performance people weren't in the team picture. I'm really proud of that. I love when I see them in the team picture. The Mitchell mission, because what you just described is suggesting that you're benefiting from a culture, because culture trumps strategy every day of the week. It's a culture of competitive excellence that we have been able to develop and will be carried on because the individuals in place have the same pride, passion, and purpose. What they do, what other leaders do in terms of perseverance and process is, comes with other leadership styles. The other piece of the puzzle that was the undercurrent was the Knetzer Family Institute.
Mm-hmm.
That I was really proud about having that opportunity, and that came from a new friend now who played football in the 80s and wanted to do something for the department. And I assumed he wanted to do something for football. And he said, no, the reason I graduated from Denison was because of mentorship and because of this and this and this, and everything was values oriented. So I said, well, here's a vision. And this is what I would like to do, an umbrella vision, create an institute. And he said, I'll fund that. And it took me a long time to have him name it after him. But, and the mission of the institute is to utilize the sport experience to intentionally develop the emotional and social competencies of our student athletes. And I thought about that early on. So I kind of had a triangle of life beyond Denison. I want you to come back to me in 5 years and say, I am prepared for life beyond Denison because of because of my experience at Denison. Leadership development, specifics of performance psychology, but also understanding the student athlete is about academic achievement, mental health, sport performance, career preparation, positive student conduct, and most importantly, inclusivity and belonging. And that's the institute. But how do those lessons get to the student? Well, we created the assistant coach mentorship program. We coached in my last year, once a month, we had specific seminars for the head coaches early morning. That's a lot on their plate. They're doing a lot, but instead of having to go to convention or to these other places to gain professional development, here it is for you through the institute.
Yeah. No,
So,
that's great. I want to ask you one more question.
okay.
So, if this conversation is the only thing a young female athlete ever hears from you, what's one message you want from her to remember?
One message, I do 3s and 5s.
Sure. 3. Yeah, let's do it. I love it.
Well, so be reflective and develop an attitude for gratitude and understand all of the work and all of the people that came before you to offer everything that you have every single day. We are afforded so much right now. I'm afforded so much right now. And at the end of the day, that comes from, relationships, and relationships matter. Authentic, honest relationships matter. And sometimes that's hard when it's peer to peer. If you're leading your peer, your toughest job you ever have is leading your peers. But there is, 40,000 alumni looking at everything you're doing. One of the greatest symbols of that was when the baseball team took the national championship trophy and put it up into the stand of alumni from every generation. There were baseball players from when I went to school in the stands, so they could all touch the trophy. So in your time at Denison, develop your I am statement. Who are you? Who are you? And how do you do that? If you ask me, I share, I am the quintessential leader in helping others find their strengths, performance potential, and energy to reach their goals by identifying their values. That's what I do in my work as an executive coach. That's what I did in my role as director. That's what I did throughout my career. So develop that. Face your fears, appreciate, have gratitude for your mentorship, and develop that attitude for gratitude.
Thank you, Nan. I really like that.
I really appreciate this time. I so appreciate you. And
you're the best.
It's been so fun watching you grow,
Thank
especially
you.
in your leadership prowess. But, it's so awesome to be connected, and soon we'll be alumni, and then we're friends.
I know. Nan, you're just such a great role model for me and so many young females in general. Thank you so much for listening to this conversation with Nan. I hope that you guys truly walked away with as much inspiration from this episode as I did. Nan's story is a powerful reminder that leadership is about serving others, staying resilient through challenges, and remaining true to your values, even when that path isn't easy. If this episode resonated with you, I'd love for you to share it with someone who could benefit from Nan's wisdom. You never know how one conversation can inspire someone else's journey. As always, thank you for being here today and for listening. I'm Violet Mitchell, and this has been Lead Like Her. I'll see you next time.